I've played a lot of PS1 games during my life, and there's some good ones and there's some rough ones. Chalk it up to that new era of 3D where people were waiting to see who could be ambitious and who could pull off this new technology. It was definitely an interesting time for sure. Now today I'm going to talk about 10 more PS1 games that you should play, games that are interesting, fun, and just overall enjoyable. Now these aren't the best games on the system, but they deserve a shot at being in your library. Let's begin. One of the franchises that I always remembered seeing in passing while looking for games to rent at Blockbuster was Armored Core. I always passed it up. A little while back, I actually played Armored Core 1 and I beat it, but I felt like it was missing something. Then I did a little research into how the games were released, and it's strange. For anyone who doesn't know, From Software made the Armored Core games in such a way that they are all nested into the first game's engine, right? For example, Armored Core 1 has two follow-ups, Project Phantasma and Master of Arena. Makes sense? Well, after completing Armored Core, I wasn't really looking forward to playing Project Phantasma, but I'm glad I did because this game is awesome. Project Phantasma is basically a prequel to Armored Core 1, but we have this new mechanic known as Arena, which is a badass 1 versus 1 with some of the deadliest ACs out there. And unlike its predecessor, it's fairly linear and only has 17 levels, but the story is much more fleshed out. If you ever mess with the original Armored Core and you feel let down, transfer your AC to Project Phantasma. You'll have a much better time. This is a game that I recently played. I say recently because the engine that the game uses was designed by Idle Minds, a company that would eventually become Deck 9, the current company I'm running a conquest on. Now, Motocross Mania, the first game, was absolute trash. I'm talking it was programmed by a group of monkeys, and those monkeys were being controlled by fleas, and those fleas were being controlled by amoebas. It was a bad shit rolls downhill scenario, but Motocross Mania 2 wasn't that bad. In terms of motocross, it's fairly generic. I could see it scratching that itch if you wanted something to play, but the only reason why it succeeded is because they used Idle Minds' engine, specifically the one used in Supercross Circuit. Now, what makes the game stand out, and likely the only reason why I saw it through, was the ability to do really cool tricks. And if you nail a trick, you get boost power. Yeah, you see that meter to the right? For like 2 hours, I thought that was a radiator or heat meter. Nope, that's a fucking boost meter. And if you use R1 after doing a badass trick, you can leave the opponents in the dust. Again, this is a very generic game, but I did enjoy it for some weird reason. This is the most recent Final Fantasy game I've played, and I've had a really good time with it. After playing Final Fantasy VI, 3 if you're from America, I had a standard of what I wanted from Final Fantasy, and by playing 7 and 8, I saw a very specific departure from what I was used to. I guess the high fantasy aspects of Final Fantasy were something that I preferred, and 9 was able to bring me back to that. I will say it wasn't much of a challenge for me, which if there ever was a shortcoming for Final Fantasy 9, it would be the fact that it is easier and more linear. Story-wise, we play as Zidane Tribal, a thief that belongs to a group of bandits who go around pretending to be a circus troupe, and our mission is to kidnap Princess Garnet. And as with most Final Fantasy games, the princess is the missing key to an astronomical amount of bullshit that will unfold for the next 9 hours of your life. But that's fine because the characters we play as, they complement each other so well, and due to the lack of any complex systems like in 7 or 8, we can just power through it. It's worth checking out. I was a huge fan of the original Harry Potter game because it was so dry, it was funny, right? Well, they continued that with the second game, in stark comparison to the PS2 version, which was absolute butthole. I'm beyond glad I played this version, because as with the first game, Chamber of Secrets follows the movie fairly well and does a solid job of keeping the plot moving forward. I will say there were far more mini-games in this one, and I found that to be a little distracting, but I mean, it's a Harry Potter game, what would you expect? By the way, cherish these early games because once EA started getting to the later films, they jumped the shark hard! Like stupid hard! to the point where Goblet of Fire is on my fucked off list. This is the first Soul Calibur game ever released, and you might be saying, it was Soul Edge, I spent a lot of money in it. Yeah, you're right, Soul Edge was the first Soul Calibur franchise game, but when the arcade version was ported to the PS1, it was renamed Soul Blade. No clue why, that's just what they did. One of the cooler things in this game is the Edge Master mode, which I was glad to see was a story mode and not what my invasive thoughts thought it would be. And when we talk about arcade fighting games, it's always nice to have a story mode if possible. I know many early fighting games revolved around only focusing on the arcade aspect, but taking that extra initiative to give consumers the ability to earn something, be it a different costume or a weapon, that's a surefire way to ensure that the consumer gets the most bang for their buck. Replayability 101. Through and through, this was a different kind of game because many other fighting games that tried to utilize weapons as a focal point, they didn't really do it well. Namco figured it out, and I'm glad that they did. Now, Soul Calibur still thrives to this day. It's a legacy franchise from Namco, and the most recent game was Soul Calibur 6, released in 2018. Why not stay on the topic of Namco, where Soul Calibur was a badass weapon-based fighting game? They did see success in the traditional fighting world as well. Tekken 1 was the first PS1 game to ever crack 1 million in sales, so naturally if you have a product that works, keep it going, right? And they did that with Tekken 2 a year later. Now fundamentally, the game isn't that different outside of a few mechanic changes. For example, if we tackle someone, we can do more damage if we run into them while tackling. And depending on how far we run, the damage adjusts. It's like sort of a momentum being taken into account. Also, the roster is quite impressive for what it is. 25 fighters in total, 17 of which moved over from Tekken 1, so that's continuity. Continuity makes me hard. I think Namco actually cares about their consumers, and I hope that as I continue my adventures through playing their games, that I do encounter more of their legacy franchises, because I'd be curious to see if they still maintain that in the modern era. Resident Evil was a masterpiece. Some people think that the survival horror genre was created by Resident Evil. I'm not one of those that believe that, but in my opinion, survival horror was perfected by Resident Evil. Certainly not created by Capcom. And if you want to know the history of survival horror, I do have a Ready Go Gaming Show entry talking all about it. I'll link it down below. Now, Resident Evil 2 rode the wave of success from Resident Evil 1, and as expected, many aspects carried over, but many were changed. Instead of Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, we have Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield, the sister of Chris. Also, instead of the T-Virus, we have the lore of the G-Virus. And this will be a trope throughout the franchise. We'll be sharing characters, we'll be learning about all these different viruses, what Umbrella is up to, but I don't want to spoil the game, so I'll leave it up to you to figure out what's going on. By the way, I've considered working on videos that talk about the timelines of video games that have a large franchise count. Think Zelda, Metal Gear Solid, even the monstrosity that is Kingdom Hearts. If this is something that would interest you, please don't hesitate to let me know down below. I'd love to do it. Now, out of all of the Resident Evil games I've played thus far, Resident Evil 2 is my second favorite. To me, it's a more fine-tuned version than the original, but hell, even the original was wonderful. Resident Evil still obviously exists, and the most recent game was a remake of Resident Evil 4 in 2023. Another Final Fantasy compilation. If you've watched my videos, you'll know I'm a huge fan of compilations. They are spectacular if done correctly, and if you do what I do every day, it helps to have a backup to some of those games that aren't doing so well on the shelf. Disk rot is a thing, ROM boards go bad, electronics fail. Now, Final Fantasy Chronicles has 2 specific games on it. Final Fantasy IV, which was already released in the US as Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo, and Chrono Trigger, which historically has been an expensive game to acquire. It's not cheap to replace either. I actually don't own the US version of Chrono Trigger because it's so expensive, but I do own it complete in box for the Super Famicom. I will say, much like all PS1 ports of the Super Nintendo titles, it does have a significant slowdown before every combat encounter, but if you can look past that, you have 2 great JRPGs to pass time on with your PS1. And I think that's worth it. Chrono Trigger alone is worth its weight in gold. I am not a fan of platformers. I know I might rate the games high, but I surely complain about it the whole time. Even Gex is an inside joke on my channel because I've played them all, many more times than I'm comfortable admitting. One of the things I hated about platformers in the 90s is that they existed during a time where you either went from left to right, up or down, or you buckled down and learned how to code a game in a 3D environment. Sometimes we have franchises that make that jump. Gex is a perfect example of that. The first Gex game was a left-to-right linear platformer, and then it jumped to 3D. Very crudely, but it did it. The same applies to Rayman. The first Rayman is a tedious and annoying left-to-right platformer, but the second game, The Great Escape, was a really fun 3D platformer. Taking place in the Glade of Dreams, we control Rayman, and we help the people who live there defend the lands from Admiral Razorbeard's band of robo-pirates. And while it might seem gimmicky, which it is, I actually enjoyed it. What blows my mind though is that Ubisoft doesn't seem to know if they want to focus on 3D Rayman games or if they want to return to their roots, because if I recall, they've been bouncing between the two quite often, or attempting to tie it in, courtesy of the Rabbids line. Fear Effect was a game that was recommended to me by my good friend KingNick69. He's a moderator on my channel, and you might run into him if you watch my live stream. Real stand-up guy. Well, he recommended Fear Effect to me, and I popped it in thinking it was going to be some weird Deus Ex-styled adventure game. But the way that Kronos Digital Entertainment designed this, it was more like a Delphine software product. Think of Out of This World or Heart of Darkness. It's a very trial and error based game, and it was also one of the first games to use cell shading, so the artwork is pretty vivid for what it is, but you can tell it's on a constant loop, at least the animation in the background. We play one of 3 characters at any given time, Hana, Deke, or Glaz, and we use tank controls to go through different levels, solving puzzles, taking out enemies. It's an experience that placing into words is incredibly difficult to do, because I just don't know how to describe the experience of playing this. I can only say it's a damn good game. You kind of get involved with the plot, and every mistake makes you learn. And I don't know, maybe I got Stockholm Syndrome or something, but I do want to check out the rest of the franchise. And that's it for today. What did you think of this list? Did you play any of these games as a kid? If so, feel free to tell the community how you felt about them. Speaking of our community, we're a group of video gaming enthusiasts that really enjoy remembering a time when life was just a little bit easier to live. And if you made it to the end of this video, you're already home. I'd personally love to have you here. Finally, the single most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.